Well, I'm here with Curtis Yarvin, also known as Mencius Moldbug, who's the developer of a project called Gray Mirror, which you can find on Substack. And it's described by Curtis as a portal to the next regime. Is that right?
That's right.
So
That's
tell
right.
me, tell me, why do we need a portal to a new regime, to this next regime?
Well, you might have, I'm not really sure of the political instincts of your listeners here, David. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And you can find Gray Mirror. It's that's Gray with an A, the American way. Graymirror.substack.com, Substack. And why do we need a portal to the next regime? Well, I don't know if you read the newspapers or watch the news sometimes. You just kind of drive around and notice that things are kind of falling to shit. I think driving around and noticing that things are kind of falling to shit is actually the best way to tell that you could maybe use a new regime. It's hard because we have all these great statistics, right? And these statistics show that everything is getting better and better, mostly, except for this coronavirus thing. But the statistics look great. But if any of y'all have been to America, outside of maybe like Palo Alto or Brooklyn or something, you kind of notice that it's kind of going to shit. And that's an observation that you make with your own eyes that you really shouldn't deny, because like whenever civilizations in the past have declined, they really don't always tend to feel they're going to shit. Actually, they often feel that they're doing better and better. It's like if you read like letters from Roman gentlemen to each other in the the late 300s, even the 400s, they're just like, they don't seem to have any idea that the Roman Empire is falling. Mm-hmm. That just doesn't seem to appear on their radar screen, and so yeah, I feel like it's difficult to look at the world today and feel that we're on the right track, and I think that my sense of what the right track is very, very, very different from most people's. And I'm guessing your audience is kind of mostly libertarians. Is that libertarians, Christians?
Yeah, I'd say
like
just
that?
conservatives, Christians, libertarians, a few Marxists. We've had Zizek on the program recently, so we pull from a few different conversations.
Probably not mostly Zizek fans, but there could be. Zizek has gotten a little heterodox recently. He's getting old. He's got nothing to lose. What's
we
funny
had our
is,
discussion, just for reference. Our discussion with Zizek was Holy Spirit, Community, and Time of Pandemic. That was the title of the discussion, and we talked about medicine a lot. So
that's interesting. He's he's an interesting fellow. He's not just a he's not a dogmatic, boring, Marxist like most people. Well, the thing is that this is a group that isn't really my natural cultural audience in some ways, because I was really born and bred a globalist. My father was in the U.S. State Department, so I have sort of the culture that you'll associate with, basically the East Coast elites. And in fact, not only was my father in the State Department, but his parents were actually Bolsheviks. They were, American, classic American Jewish communists from Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And so, that culture, I was never raised a communist, but I certainly grew up a Cold War, liberal. And, the culture of these institutions is basically where I'm coming from. And I think, a lot of conservatives sort of have these illusions that these institutions in some way are can be reformed or are salvageable, or you're just like, how do we get the Marxists out of Harvard or something like that, right. Which is basically sort of like, okay, you just invaded Germany, how do we get the Nazis out of the SS?
Hmm.
And the answer is you don't get the Nazis out of the
Right.
SS. The SS is a Nazi organization, and but can there be a Germany without the SS? Can we imagine Germany without the SS? Well, today we
Hmm.
have Germany without the SS, and I think most people think that's generally a good thing. And so when you look at institutions, you have to admit that sort of institutions have a lifespan. They're born and they die. The other
Hmm.
thing that people don't understand when they look at these institutions is that they look at Harvard and they're like, oh well, Harvard's a private university. It's private just the way like McDonald's is private, or it's a company. I mean, it's not a for-profit company. It's
Hmm.
it's it's a bizarre nonprofit, but it's certainly not part of the government. And
Hmm.
and they look at Harvard and they basically don't think of it as a government agency, which is in fact what it is,
Right.
or objectively what it is. And so when you expand the regime to include, and we can get into like why, I think it's correct to consider Harvard a government agency if you want. But when we get into, okay, let's seriously look at just what is this regime? What is this government? Why does it do these crazy things?
Hmm.
Where is this coming from? Another example that I like to look at sort of at how superficial people are in examining these problems is most of your listeners have probably heard the term SJW, right?
Hmm.
So SJW stands for social justice warrior, and then there's this term social justice, right? So what does this word mean? Social justice. Like if we like look at it literally and we say, what does social justice mean literally? Well,
Hmm.
it doesn't really mean anything. Like the words don't really tell you anything. But clearly this is a label, this is a phrase that has a very powerful hold. You'll just see it in all kinds of bureaucratic boilerplate. Well, Google has this very interesting site called ngrams, as in just ngrams .google.com, where they took all the books published in the world and they basically count all of the phrases, words and phrases used in these books and how frequently they appear over time. And so you can go and you can look at, okay, here's, the word racism or the word, homophobia, right? When did people start saying homophobia? Was anyone saying homophobia in 1950? No, they were not.
Hmm.
Was anyone saying racism in 1950? Barely. 1930? No. Was anyone saying social justice in 1950? They were. Was anyone saying social justice in 1900?
Hmm.
They were. And so, you see this curve going up and it has some little humps and bumps, but it goes up steadily to the present and, is of course spiking like crazy right now. And this curve dates back to the 1880s. And, before then it's kind of lost in the noise, but the 1880s, right? So, if you're looking at this problem and you're saying, okay, here's this problem of cancel culture, right, or something like that, where a lot of people who are not conservatives, genuinely liberals, are like, hey, wait, this is going too far. They're like, oh, this is something that started in 2012 or something,
Hmm.
and I'm like, no. This
Yeah.
did not start in 2012. This is not
Right.
a new problem. This is not a shallow problem. This is not a problem that is amenable to new and shallow solutions. This is a problem that is a very old problem. And because it's a very old problem, we should only expect it to be solved by very sort of deep and complicated thinking.
And why do you consider
And
it a problem?
why do I consider it a problem? Well, I'm probably agreeing with most of your readers here, but your listeners. I would say, there's this old document called the Declaration of Independence, and it's actually of no legal significance, but
Isn't it in the
you
U.S.
know,
National Code, the Declaration of
yeah,
Independence?
no,
I
no,
think it
no,
is.
no,
Yeah.
it is. Well,
Yeah.
I,
It's actually in the U.S. National Code, so it's kind of
it's
law.
actually kind of law. Well, in this kind of law, or this little piece of paper, it says something like, when any form of government has proved destructive, to its citizens, I'm paraphrasing here,
Yeah.
then it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And, here you have this ironic, there's this sort of ironic situation, which is that here we instituted this form of government, and just empirically, it doesn't seem to be working very well.
Right.
And it doesn't really seem to be working very well for anyone. You really, it's pretty difficult to say, oh wow, this our regime isn't working out, well for white people, but it sure works well for black people. Does it? No, I don't think so. It doesn't look. I take a drive through a black area. You're welcome. Is that working out well? I don't think it's working out well. I can say that it's working out well for Palo Alto. I think Palo Alto is really doing very well with this regime, but that's not enough for me. I don't think it should be, and it's not enough for.
So
Palo Alto.
you're a real humanist at heart. You want to see humanity flourish. You want to see prosperity. You want to see security.
So
your globalist roots are still in you. You want to see humanity go in a better direction.
Well, the classic.
Because I don't have a problem with the word globalism. It's just what kind of globalism.
No. I'm the global. Sure, I'm a humanist. I think that America needs to. The only way to get the globe in order is to get America in order, because America is the leader of the globe, like it or not. I don't really like it, but it's how it is. And so there's a classic Latin phrase which expresses the purpose of government, which is, it's actually the state motto of Missouri. It's Salus Populi Suprema Lex. The health of the people shall be the supreme law. And, like any short Latin phrase, that's a little bit ambiguous. What do you mean by the health of the people? Do you mean their physical health? Well, we've had some issues with that, lately. Turning off a few flights in January would have saved some serious problems. But it's more than physical. It's like, are you looking at, if you imagine, what is the health of, say, New York? What is the health of Indiana? That's a question. One of my favorite writers is the British writer Thomas Carlyle. From the 19th century, who coined this phrase, the condition of England question. And he made this point, which is that you can't really, how is England doing can't really be expressed in numbers. You have to actually look at these people and say, how are they doing? Are they industrious? Are they, virtuous? Or are they living around, shooting opium, or fentanyl? In houses with boarded up windows? Are they being used as industrial robots in like Dickensian factories? Are they, and if we look at America, and if we look at, the fractions of America that are not, Brooklyn, I guess Brooklyn's not looking so great these days either, but certainly Palo Alto is still, I don't think they even have any boarded up windows in Palo Alto still. Haven't been back there in a little while, but it's doing great. The stocks are up, everybody's happy. That's clearly not the case for the entire country. And yet, here are these numbers, and GDP goes up every year, right? And so there's there's something that's not being captured properly by these signals of health. And these signals, so do we have and these are more than physical. Do we have a healthy intellectual space? Are we having new good ideas, or are we just increasingly convulsed with these like strange paranoid conspiracy theories? In case you haven't noticed, mainstream conspiracy theories are really kind of a thing these days.
Right.
Arguably, they've been a thing for some time, but you can't help sort of notice that the thinking that you're imbibing from these from the most prestigious institutions of our time is strange and disordered. And, it's a sort of strange, disordered thought that you read about in history, and you're just like, wow, how did this whole country develop these strange, disordered, kind of cramped and paranoid thoughts? And you're like, this is us, and, these thoughts are mandatory. So, when you see the level of dysfunction here, it's like the way I kind of parallel the belief in a serious regime transition is, imagine you're in the Soviet Union in the mid 80s. So, you're in the Soviet Union and you're like, oh, wow, things are pretty fucked, if you'll excuse my French. Sorry, you can bleep that. You're looking at the Soviet Union and you're like, things are not very good. And why are they not very good? And almost everyone who's thinking about that problem in the Soviet Union in the mid 80s, the dissidents, the reformers, are all of that, are thinking, how can we fix the Soviet Union? They don't even think about how do we, is that the right question to be asking? Obviously, it's the right question to be asking. So when it turns out that actually the Soviet Union just falls apart, people are surprised. They're like, even the dissidents are surprised. They're like, but this is not what we were trying to do. Right. And they had no plan. They had no, they were like the dog that caught the car. They were like, okay, we realize in retrospect that the idea of fixing this, shambolic thing was completely untenable. And it actually couldn't be fixed, and it could only fall apart. But it fell apart, and we have no idea where to go from here. We have no plan and no vision, and we don't really understand. In the Soviet Union, of course, it could fall apart in favor of the Western system. Here, we don't have any sort of competing, except for maybe China, which is really substandard and, which is very impressive in some ways, but really not what Americans want in many other ways. We don't really have an example of another system that works in the present. Our examples have to be formed from the past, and the past is so, as they say, the past is a foreign country. It's so different from the present that it really takes a lot of work to establish that, to make that connection clear. To understand, it's like you look at the past and you're like, okay, first of all, maybe they're wrong about this or you're wrong about that. But it's so different that we can't even know what they would recommend that we do. And although, we can guess, and certainly that's a very interesting exercise. So you're really this is not a style of thinking that you're going to get from sort of the mainstream American conservative or even libertarian tradition.
Sure.
Right. So that's really the open-ended purpose of the project, is to say, okay, let's seriously think about, without sort of any assumptions that anything that we have here is perfect or ideal. Because when you look at, American history, which of course goes back well before the Declaration of Independence, it's really a 400-year, history. It's not a 250-year history. When you look at this whole history, you see something, you can interpret it in the way that people tried to in the 20th century as this sort of, epic, almost Hebraic, saga of, creating the city on the hill. And, it's easy to sort of do that and have this kind of heroic, almost very Soviet vision of American history as having this, teleology of ending in this perfect state. Well, it hasn't ended up in this perfect state. And if you look at it in a sort of more objective scientific light, you see a record of just people trying to do shit that works. They try to do stuff that works. They're like, okay, this didn't work. Let's try something else. It's sort of a normal, it's not a kind of, the Deseret News, the newspaper of Utah, after Utah accepted that it was not going to be a theocratic republic of its own, decided that they liked the Constitution. And so I don't know if this is still true, but the Deseret News used to have on its masthead, we believe that the Constitution of the United States was divinely inspired. I'm like, well, God works in mysterious ways, whether you're a Christian or you're not. But I fundamentally believe that all of these things were documents created by human beings who were in many cases amazing human beings who were trying their best at the time. I think if the founders of the Constitution of 1789 looked at the United States today, they'd say, but this has no connection with
Right. It's a coup.
with this paper we wrote. Yeah, I mean, it's not even one coup; it's several coups.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's an evolution of coups. Yeah,
it's an evolution. It's a series of coups. You know,
and so, but we shouldn't expect anything else if it's a country founded by revolutionary spirit, that other revolutionary spirits are going to overthrow the earlier revolutionary spirits, right? So you have kind of an attack on the founding moment, the founding mythology.
None of these revolutionary spirits were perfect, and moreover, when you look at the real history of the period, you'll note that in many cases, we tend to equate 1776 and 1789, right. And in many ways, 1789 is actually an attack on 1776, right? And so it's like Russia's two revolutions, or France has two revolutions, and this one, 1789, was really a reactionary coup against Congress of the Confederation, which has been totally airbrushed out of history, right?
Sure,
who was America's first president? Was it John Hanson? Or
that's my great-great-grandfather, actually. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
There you go. So thank you for giving a little nod,
a little plug for the Congress of the Confederation.
Yeah. Now I happen to like Luther Martin. I was introduced to him, this forgotten founder, drunken prophet, according to Bill Kaufman, who wrote this biography.
No, I really don't know Luther Martin. Was he North Carolina?
He was from Maryland, and he's actually, his grave is paved over by a sidewalk, because he was one of the opponents of the Constitution in the actual convention. Jefferson was out having fun in France. That's when they got together and did the Constitutional Convention, and Luther Martin was this kind of verbose guy that he would get drunk. When he would do his trials as an attorney, he would soak a sponge with wine, because they didn't allow him to drink during his court sessions, and so he would he would just have that sponge get into him, and he would get drunk and just go for hours about his ideas. And he was not very articulate. He wasn't the stylish rhetorician of others of that time, and he lost. But he was a noble loser, because he was trying to preserve.
He had presence. Yeah, he was basically the Alex Jones of the founders, basically.
Right. and he's paved over by a sidewalk now. So that's the glory of the original founding republic spirit of decentralized, power.
Yeah. Well, certainly the Congress of the Confederation period. I mean, that period was, it was not a great success, and that was, essentially the motivation for the Constitutional Convention, is that they tried this great theoretical sort of confederation that came out of their Lockean heritage, and which is really a heritage of, I think most Americans, when they consider that founding population, have failed to sort of reckon with something that really comes very clearly out of the source text for me, which is that this was a population of law nerds. They were all basically, not only were there a lot of lawyers, but they were all basically trained that essentially lawfare was the path to power. And not only was there an intense amount of really, I would say, very sketchy lawfare, in the Revolutionary period, of course. Going back earlier to the previous Civil War, which is part of our heritage too, which is the English Civil War, you see, Charles I is basically getting lawfared out of his job by, the Cooks and Blackstones and, all these legal authorities that legal historians sort of revere. But when you look at them, politically, they're basically coming up with these sort of very spurious arguments as to why Charles I isn't actually the king and shouldn't actually be doing any kinging. And these are just very spurious, like, they'll sort of appeal to these old Saxon traditions or whatever, which don't really exist. And what they're expressing is really just the rising virtue and power of the Puritan class. But if you look at their legal arguments, Queen Elizabeth would look at them and be just like, "This is baloney. I'm the queen," and so that's a really important part, that sort of use of law to bring down, as a pretext for bringing down centralized power, is a really important part of the U.S. heritage. And what these very virtuous, very good people discovered in the period of the Congress of the Confederation was that the whole thing was kind of a nightmare. And so they're basically like, they didn't quite say we need a king, although there was a lot of certainly, it's unclear whether Washington could have had that job if he'd wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
But what they created was essentially a very king-like, national government, which did not explicitly, accept the name of a national government. It was still technically federated, but in fact, it was the Federalists with Washington and Hamilton acting as really acting as a national government, and acting almost as an elected dictatorship in many ways. They'd created the government, they were entirely in control of it. And then even when the Federalists lose their political power and the anti-federalists are elected, Jefferson is like, okay, I guess I was against this, but I guess I'll keep it this way.
Kind of nice.
Right?
I like it. Yeah.
And so, the Federalist Party disappeared, but the Federalist institutions all remained. Similar to the way that the Bourbons, when they came back to France after Napoleon, kept the Napoleonic institutions. That's a thing that happens in these regime changes. And so when you look at this as the history of, imperfect people trying to do imperfect things, and you're not looking at it as a sort of, almost sort of quasi-religious path toward the city on the hill, that really opens your mind, because you're just like, okay, these people did some things right, they did some things wrong. What they did has sort of little relationship to what we're doing now.
So you're saying, in other words, you're saying, let's not sacralize it, but let's not demonize it. Let's just look at it as kind of as almost kind of
as a historical. As a historical event, let's
dispassionately analyze it, not
let's live in history.
It.
It's like when you read about, say, the Peloponnesian War or something. Athens and Sparta have some modern resonances, but nobody's like, oh, I'm on Athens' side.
Yeah.
No historian is like, or you read about the 100 Years' War. No historian is like, well, I think the French were all wrong in the 100 Years' War, and I'm glad we kicked their ass at the Battle of Crécy, right? No professional historian would think that way. They wouldn't pick a side.
Right.
But as we come closer to the present, they have to pick sides. And so what they're doing is not really sort of even respectful, to the history. Whereas if you look at any period of history that is sort of so long ago that we can take it objectively, we normally look at a conflict and we see most people on both sides of any war are fighting for what they think is good. They have different visions of the good. You can very rarely get people to fight for evil. And you can inhabit these visions of the good. You can understand what they were trying to do, and you can understand why they hated each other and wanted to fight each other. And so when you're in the modern world, of course, it's like we the just versus our enemies, the demons, and you're still in this kind of military mindset. And so the way that most Americans view their sort of political system, it's sort of the way that everyone views their political system is this is the one true thing, and then everything else outside of this one true thing is this sort of strange world of like, it's this dark forest, it's this strange world of scary places.
Yeah, and so let's step back for a second. So you've laid out a very interesting frame. I'm going to go a little higher up now and look at world history in general. So is history going somewhere?
Well, I think people thought that for a few centuries, and I think that
the Marxists, the Whigs, there's the Whig view of history.
And those, the Marxist theory of history and the Whig theory of history are not really too different, because in both of those there's this sort of clear telos. There's this association with modernization where everything is getting better, and you see this because of, the Industrial Revolution and the technological revolution. These are things that have never happened before, in quite any sense in human history. You've had some, certainly had periods where technology and industry grew rapidly, but not really like this. And so it's very easy to see any trend that's sort of going along with that and following that trend and say, well, this is the future, just like physics is the future.
Right.
Like, like quantum physics is the future, so social science is supposed to be the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, well, actually, no, social science is basically completely fake, or at least 20th century social science is like, actually these people don't know anything, and when you look at the way they think, they're just bullshit artists. And so you're actually seeing all of this bullshit that's essentially come in a train along with, good stuff like quantum physics. And to recognize there's another fact which is sort of even more disturbing, which you recognize with that, which is a question that maybe your audience can do a good job at, but mostly when I ask people these questions, they feel a little bit ashamed. Which is, I simply say, do you think you are a better person, a better human being than the average of your 4 grandparents at the same age?
Mm-hmm.
What about the average of your 8 great-grandparents?
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask people that question, they're like, but what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, well, the fact that you don't even know, like, you don't even have a basis for establishing that is like, would you say, well, I'm a better person than my grandparents because I make more money than they did, because, grandma only made $2,000 a year and I make $40,000 a year, or whatever. No,
Right.
I mean, that's not a meaningful way to compare,
Sure.
First of all, because of inflation, but secondly, that just means how much, like, good stuff do I have in my life? Like, does that make me a better person? No, I think actually it might even make me a worse person.
Mm-hmm. More money, more problems.
More money, more problems, and more, the difficulty of struggling against, nature 100 years ago created a lot of virtue.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of virtue in basically sitting around getting your UBI, playing on your PlayStation, and smoking your legal weed, and that's the direction of modern life in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you look at that, you're like, okay, exercise is difficult. Exercise, physical exercise is difficult, but it makes me a better person. But does this principle apply outside of the physical? Maybe it does. And so what you're seeing is that actually this technology has resulted in a declining level of challenge in people's lives, and finding, moreover, the kind of challenge that's like beneficial to human beings is the kind that makes you grow and flourish and thrive. It's the kind that you can actually solve. The challenge of, I got to pay off my student loans while working like a shit retail job at Best Buy is not, that's not a challenge that develops you as a human being in the same way as the challenge of like, I'm going to go into this unoccupied area and build a log cabin and, survive with my family off of like.
It sounds like the Unabomber, and that sounds like his manifesto, right?
Yeah. Well,
technology's made us soft. We need a total reset or something. Right?
He was certainly right about some things and not about others. And you can say that for many human beings. But this way of thinking is so distinct from the way of thinking of everything's always getting better, and how do we make things better? We need more toys, more stuff.
So you have the kind of the. Like Matt Ridley, I've interviewed him, and he talks about rational optimism for the future, and it's very compelling. And I don't think we have to choose one or the other. I think we can see history. So, for example, like the ancients, of course, most of their view of history was rather cyclical, and kind of the eternal return idea. And then with Christianity, the Jewish prophets and the Christian follow up, you get this kind of, we're going somewhere, right? And that's where the Whigs and the Marxists, they're borrowing from Christian eschatological language and ideas of the history going somewhere, going towards a better place. And I just think you can kind of fit those things together and say it's kind of a curlicue, so you're still getting the cycles, but now with Christianity we are kind of moving somewhere. And it's not autopilot now. It's not autopilot. It's not Epcot where you're getting on a ride. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Christianity, also, I believe, I'm far from an expert in the area, but it does include the Book of Revelation and the concept of getting somewhere, but maybe this is not maybe this is not an easy road, does appear. And it's like I'm not a Christian. I'm a globalist, but
Well, that's the same
a
thing
couple.
in
A
some
couple,
ways.
well, it's developed from it, but it's a heresy. And once I was a couple of years ago, I'm not really a football fan or anything, but I found myself watching the Super Bowl, halftime show, and there was a certain female performer, in that halftime show, and I realized that this was. Like it or not, I was basically looking at a very impressive and detailed reconstruction of the Whore of Babylon, and and here are all these very good Americans out there in their conservative parts of America, which I have to admit I think of as the real America only because it's so foreign to me, and here they all are watching the Whore of Babylon on their Super Bowl halftime show.
I was at I think I know the one you're talking about, but it's everyone. But I think
it's everyone, right?
But I think I know the one you're talking about. I was actually at a church, at a Super Bowl party at a church, and the whole staff is there, and there's kids playing around, and that's on the big jumbo screen they've got in the rec room or whatever for the whole church and to watch this. And the kids start dancing, and then they're like, "Wait, no, we don't dance to that," and it was so confusing,
and it's confusing and disturbing, and it's like you're trying to sort of not see this because it's something that's so disturbing that you can't really see it. Now, of course, the same people have to go and watch the athletes kneeling for the national anthem, which maybe can be spun to small children as a sign of respect. I don't know, but
well, the difference also is that this is both a product of Christianity's impact in the West, but also revolt against it. And it's precisely because those displays of vulgarity are considered to be aspirational, to be considered empowerment, whereas in the ancient world, they may do those kind of debauched displays of vulgarity, but it was considered, this is for our entertainment and consumption. This is not something to, aspire to be. This is not, of course, they didn't even have an aspirational hierarchical structure of moving up.
They did even before Christianity, I think the pagan Romans felt some shame, at the sites of decadence. I mean,
Right.
Let's not forget that the Romans began as this very, extremely, I mean, our word virtue, of course, comes from the Latin word virtus, which means something else, slightly, but, they were certainly a very moral people in 300 BC, not so much 300 AD. And so what you're seeing, it's interesting because, you look at this and you're like this curve and you're like, okay, there's a telos here. And what you're actually seeing, if you could separate the curves of sort of human virtue and technical capacity, one thought experiment that I like is to say, okay, let's admit that it's possible that your great-grandparents were better people than you on average. Obviously it depends, but let's take America in 1920 and get a time machine, and we're going to teleport the America of 1920 completely intact somewhere into an unoccupied part of the South Pacific in 2020. Okay, what happens? So you have all these people, they don't have great technology. How long does it take them to basically download Wikipedia and catch up on their chip fabrication? Probably not very long. How long does it take for them to just kick our asses in every possible direction? Not long at all. I mean, you've seen film from that period. You've seen the people in the streets. You've seen photos. You've seen this is a busy America. This is an energetic America. This is they've just come through a war. There's various economic problems, but this is a country that could kick China's ass. And today, of course, our ass is getting kicked by China, in not militarily, but certainly in the domain of economic war. And so you're looking at this and you're like, no, actually, there's been a very real degeneration in the human quality of this country. Even even just counting the descendants of people who were there at that time, you're like, yeah, if I were building a country, who would I draft? Would I draft you or your grandparents? Well, frankly, I'd probably draft your grandparents. And that's a.
But some of those standards that you're judging the difference are based on more classical standards, right? Would you say?
Sure.
Nietzsche,
sure.
not Nietzsche. I don't want to go there but it's kind of a little bit Nietzsche. You're talking
I'm the standards that I'm using are the standards by which humans, were judged for, thousands of years.
Right.
And so when you see those standards change, you're like, okay, are these new standards, better standards? Do they work better for people? Are they more successful in, objectively in any way? No, well, maybe I'll consider using the old ones. Moreover, I don't know how much exposure you have to science, but, in the principles of the philosophy of science, one of the big principles is when you do an experiment, you need to evaluate the results of the experiment by standards that were set before the experiment. Because if you otherwise you're basically shooting at a barn. You're performing what's called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, because you're shooting at a barn, looking at the holes, and then drawing a bullseye around the holes. And that doesn't show that you were shooting accurately. And so, like the phrase "the American experiment" has been frequently used throughout American history. In the early part of the 20th century, people used to talk about the Soviet experiment. I think we've seen the results of that experiment. The great experiment of 20th century governance, I think, has not produced anything like the results that it expected. And you have to basically say, wow, what would people of 1920 think of what we've done here? And
not
I
very
think the answer
good.
is, I had an interesting interaction once. I don't know how many military listeners you have or people from that culture, but I imagine there's one or two. So General McChrystal, who was the commander in Afghanistan for a while, who was kicked out by Rolling Stone, basically. He was kicked out by a hit piece in Rolling Stone, but he was a Special Forces veteran, very capable guy. And after his ejection, he went around doing lectures, as is the custom, and he came to a venture capital firm in San Francisco and gave a lecture. And I happened to be sitting in the audience, so there's about 50 people there, and it's kind of stock lecture. And at the end of the lecture, I raise my hand and I ask what I think is going to be a question that will just totally wipe this guy out, right? So I get called on, and I raise my hand, and my question is, so here you are in this part of the world that has seen a lot of previous Western attempts at imposing governance on it, and here you are, you're fighting in what's basically part of the Indian world. And so you have all of this experience from the British Empire of people who tried to do exactly what you're trying to do here, to pacify these kinds of people. What do you think, General McChrystal, that an Indian district commissioner from 100 years ago would think about how we'd done in Afghanistan? How would they evaluate our work? And he was just like, yeah, I don't think they think we'd done a very good job. And I was like, no more questions, and he'd clearly thought about this question, right? Or he was just that smart. And, but I couldn't return that serve, and,
well,
but that's a question that's so rarely asked, is what would the people who actually set up this experiment think of what we'd done? How would they change their minds? Because if we say, oh, they wanted this, no, they clearly didn't. If then we say, oh, well, they wouldn't change their minds, we'd be like, well, they're stupid. And that's a way of thinking that people don't really sort of get into when they're locked in the sort of the latest news cycle.
Right. It reminds me of a discussion I had with a friend of mine who's a Marine veteran who was over in Afghanistan and saw a lot of awful things. Someone who was a Christian, someone who was a big warrior and believer in the virtue of America. And he goes over there and he says, he saw examples in which the military, the soldiers, were being used to be protection detail for pedophilic warlords.
Yeah.
And he saw one of his friends, some of his friends got blown up by a 13-year-old boy who was being exploited by these warlords that our soldiers were protecting so that they could facilitate their trafficking ring. And he blew up his friends. And think about the mind screw that does, right? I mean, your friends are killed by a 13-year-old who's angry because you guys are basically acting as Jeffrey Epstein's personal security detail, so he can. I mean, equivalent.
That's right. I mean, it's
awful. It's totally horrendous.
It's straight out of Apocalypse Now, and
or David Lynch or something, or
David Lynch. It's horrific and surreal and absurd. And here you have these Americans who are basically signing up for this service under the theory that they're, defending America in some ways. And this theory simply can't be you can't find anyone who actually believes in that effort, but, it's, hesitate to say profitable. It has a momentum, it has a bureaucratic and economic momentum of its own. And it comes from, and the thing is that when you look, that's another sort of good example of how deep the problem goes, because, when 9/11 happened, as you may recall, they developed this interesting term, Homeland Security. We developed this Department of Homeland Security. And it sort of caused people to ask, at a certain point, you have this linguistic problem where you have these two concepts. One of them is Homeland Security, and the other one is national security. And they would appear to be the same, linguistically, they're the same thing. But in fact, national security means ruling the world. Okay, how did national security come to mean ruling the world? And again, you have to go back to before the lives of those now living.
Well, it's the same way federalism came to mean nationalism, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so, at one point, basically, FDR literally says, I forget the exact line. Well, he said, America's frontier is on the Rhine. That was before the war. He denied saying that, but he did in fact say it. And then later during the war, he said something like, political events anywhere in the world affect America's national security, right? And so you've basically gone out...
Very insecure.
Very insecure. You've basically gone out, on this somewhat, dubious thesis of this Axis plan to conquer the world, which probably never even really existed, even though, those people were just as awful as we said they were. But they were just as awful as we said they were, but they were not at that time trying to conquer the world, which we basically were. And so we conquered the world, and, that created a lot of interesting things. It certainly created, kind of my childhood as an imperial proconsul. I started to realize kind of as a teenager that the purpose of an American embassy in a country isn't to sort of relate to it on a peer-to-peer basis, but actually to supervise it. And I was like, whoa, I'm like, wait, technically, the United States and Portugal are equals. And in fact, we have a treaty that says that if Portugal is attacked, the United States will defend it. But if the United States is attacked, Portugal will come to its rescue.
Right.
But, this isn't actually the structure. And then you're just like, wait a second. The Soviets claim to have something exactly like this, where they're like, oh, yeah, we have socialist brotherhood between Poland and the USSR. But, it doesn't appear to be entirely completely brotherly.
Well, it's this strange admixture of Christian universalist zeal mixed with pagan sacred practices.
Yes,
and it's all mixed together.
Yes. And it's all mixed together, and it's basically doing this thing that you can read about in many, many texts before... you read Vattel on the Law of Nations, and, Vattel will explain to you the concept of a satellite state. And he'll be like, okay, this is a protectorate. This is not a real country, because a real country has its own foreign policy and the right to make war. And as soon as you've lost the right to make war, you're not an independent country anymore.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, Vattel is telling me that the United States is a global empire. And because, clearly it would not tolerate, Spain and Portugal making war on each other.
But I think I want to go back to you compared that Afghanistan, success versus the past. And you said it's not doesn't look as nice as our past.
Yeah. The thing is, I have a somewhat of a history of being a conservative and a libertarian, and in some ways, the things that knocked me out of that are sort of most interesting. And so to me, and so it's like I believed in the war in Iraq because I was like, okay, here's this, it's just like Nazi Germany. You're going to go in there, you're going to take this horrendous political system, you're going to clean it up, and you're going to turn it into something that roughly resembles New Jersey. Right. And, actually, it's gone a little bit more the other way. New Jersey looks a little bit more like Iraq. Iraq does not look anything like New Jersey, and this didn't actually work. Why didn't it actually work? It didn't actually work because the occupation of Germany, if you look into the way that the occupation of Germany was done, it did not, even though the people who occupied Germany had the values, very much the values of the present, the methods that they used were very much the methods of more like the British Empire. And so, if you read the occupational directives in Germany, it's like, don't fraternize with these people. You have to remember that they're a conquered country. They should be fed 800 calories a day. It was almost Stalinist in some ways. It was like this weird mixture of the British Empire and of Stalin. And it left no, the U.S. made it very, very clear who was in charge. We were not liberating Germany. We were not like restoring it to have its own political destiny. We were conquering it, and that was very effective. And the Germans were very effectively conquered, and they have been very faithful ever since. And radical German terrorism has not threatened America. And then you come into these other countries, and you can't do that. You have this pretext of like, oh, we're not conquering you, we're liberating you. We're not here to make Iraq the 51st state or, Kandahar, Camden, New Jersey. We're here to help you live out your own destiny, except that it has to be your destiny in the way that, we believe in. And, it's just like, it simply doesn't work. And
well, I want to explain why I think that is. Well, go ahead and finish. I want to try to take a stab at it.
It simply doesn't work. And so you have this strange, like the things that allowed the U.S. to conquer Nazi Germany effectively were aspects of the American way of being in the 1940s that if we move those into 2020, everyone would be like, well, that's super Nazi,
Right.
And so, it had the let's say not the Nazi, but the Spartan elements in American culture were much, much stronger at that time. And so, certainly the Americans who went ashore in France were basically like, we're protecting America from a Nazi invasion. They're not like, oh, we're invading Europe so that, Europe can have racial and gender equality,
Right.
and that was not in their minds. And so, in fact, what they did was much more sort of pre-modern than modern. Now we've sort of eliminated all of those Spartan elements from our culture, except
right.
in various vestigial ways in the military, and we find that it just doesn't work.
So here's my stab at this. I think maybe you'll
Sure.
see something here. So
Please.
the elephant in the room here is the Christianity aspect. So here's the thing. Think of Christianity as like an infection. When we have an infection that's destroying the system that we're trying to keep revivified through various, narratives that we put out there in the world to remake the world this way or that way, and to let So, for example, when I think about you talk about red pill, you were famous for making that a thing, and then you talk about the clear pill. Well, you got to think of Christianity. We reject all forms of pills. We reject the pharmakos. Okay, the pharmakos in our framework of Christianity is the ritual human sacrifice that underpins the structures of so much of the world for thousands of years. So here's
sorry, go on.
Well, my point is to think of what Christianity is doing. You have to think of a purge. We don't take a pill. We're vomiting up all the pills that we've been taking in history.
Oh yeah,
and that's what Christianity is about. It's I'd rather spew you out, is what the writer of Revelation says. I would rather spew you out than that you were lukewarm, like the Laodicea church.
I use that quote in one of my recent pieces, and you were.
So we're out of pills, man. We need a purge. We need to vomit.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, of course, there are there are so many definitions of Christianity, and so many ways to interpret.
Well, I'm looking at it
that work.
anthropologically, so I'm going to borrow a little bit from mimetic
Yeah.
theory.
Well, if I can go a little farther and look at it, politically, there's something, it cannot be denied that, of course, you can read Jesus as he's a protean figure, and you can read him in so many different ways. But you can certainly read him as a revolutionary leader, right? And if you look at the milieu in which he was operating, there were a lot of prototypical revolutionary leaders. I mean, the Jewish revolutionary spirit of that time is really a thing. And, you have all of these, and most of them are just, I would almost say kind of terrorists straight out of, like the whole Masada experience. Like these are, there's a very ISIS-like quality at work.
Well, there's two Jesuses in the persecution of Jesus. You know that, right? And the Pilate.
I did know that. But
and Pilate,
it's a common name.
Barabbas.
Yeah.
Was Jesus Barabbas. He was the earliest.
I didn't know he was Jesus Barabbas.
In the text, the earliest gospel text, he's named Jesus Barabbas, which means Jesus Bar of Abba, the Father. So there's two Jesuses, son of the Father, that are on trial.
And
the crowd.
And Barabbas is just a bandit, right?
Yeah, he's like Mel Gibson's. He's like Mel Gibson's William Wallace. That's what he is. He's a revolutionary.
Right, yeah.
So he wants to overthrow through violence.
Yes, he's a revolutionary bandit, right? And that's common. That's a normal thing.
He's Robin Hood.
He's Robin Hood, right? Whereas Jesus is not a normal thing. And, there's this great line that Jesus has, which is, of course, the render unto Caesar line. And, most people have sort of heard that line, but, the story there is so good because he's basically like, here's Jesus, this revolutionary leader. And, people are like, okay, Comrade Jesus, should we pay taxes? And Jesus is like, when you pay taxes, what are you paying them in? And he's like, well, these coins. Bring me the coin. Show me the coin. And, he's like, well, this coin says Caesar on it. So I think it's clearly Caesar's. And
what's interesting there is he doesn't have a coin on his possession. And when he asked them, present me a coin, that's a religious figure who has got a coin on him. And so when he brings it out, it's a picture of Augustus, Caesar Augustus, which is bearing a false idol. So he's making he's destroying their whole hypocrisy right in front of them because they're saying you're bearing false idols in your pocket because it says Caesar, son of God. You know what I mean?
And he's requiring them to separate basically, this thing of saying the prohibition on worshiping this false idol is basically as strong as the rule of, you got to actually pay your taxes. And as a piece of revolutionary praxis, what this turns into is, this is, obviously it's not my idea. It wasn't even Jesus's idea, but it's a great idea, is essentially that rather when you see this system, Jesus is like, okay, let's think of Jesus as a very practical revolutionary leader here. He's like, I'm not going to have last time we had a Jewish revolt and tried to overthrow we weren't even trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. We're just trying to get it out of Israel. And, it was this massive disaster, right? Because Titus burned Jerusalem and took the Holy of Holies, yada, yada, yada. And this is not the way. This is not how we're going to do this thing. And so, this is a supremely practical act where you essentially say, look, here are the two things we can't compromise on. We can't revolt against Caesar. And so what we have to actually do, rather than revolting against Caesar, is deny his spiritual authority. We can't worship Caesar. We live in this place. We're ruled by Caesar. You know what? Our objective is not to get Caesar to bother us. Actually, our objective is to have Caesar not bother us. Let's actually live in a way such that we are giving as little offense as possible to Caesar so that we can live in the way that we find to be good. And so you compare, it's like if you're looking for a modern equivalent of that strategy, let's compare the approach of, Christians who are sort of pushing back against the modern world which is, of course, obviously very, very common. You go back, I don't know that there's anything left of like the moral majority or anything like that, but these are very, these are Christian warriors. This is the church militant, right? And then you compare that to, say, the Amish. Now, the Amish are very, very Christian, and the Amish approach is very much that of Jesus, which is that we are going to stay out of your way. We're not even going to vote in your goddamn elections, and we're going to live in the way that we judge to be godly. Somehow they're still allowed to do that. I don't know if that will last, really very long in this modern world, but they're allowed to do that. And actually, speaking of the Amish, and, we were talking about technology, earlier, I think that we have a lot to learn from those people. And there's
great food.
There's one study that was done that I read, and of course, now this is a social science study, so take it with however much salt you have in the house. I have some 40-pound bags for the well. Take it with a grain of salt because you know who's doing this. But nonetheless, the results I thought were striking, which is that they interviewed a bunch of people to ask them simply how satisfied they were with their life as a human being. And the people who scored the top, absolutely the top on this survey, you'll never guess, is billionaires. Billionaires, it turns out, are very satisfied with their lives. Slightly behind the billionaires, Amish. And so, you have, you're like, okay, this is something that works. It's not quite the same as like Ted Kaczynski being against technology. It's a little bit different, but there's maybe some common ground there. And this is so far outside whether it's a Whig telos or a Marxist telos or sort of any picture of
what's
what
a Christian
telos
telos that we're on, yeah. I would say.
Well, there are many forms of Christian telos.
Here's the thing: we can actually kind of look at it anthropologically and see a pattern in history. That's what I'm kind of suggesting: is that it doesn't have to be just purely a subjective rendering. Although you can get 50 levels of subjective learnings and interpretations of things that Jesus does, you can actually look at the trajectory of history and see that there is objective facts that we can discern that Christianity has made a particular type of impact on history. So, for example, so when we look at, like, you were talking about Jesus, with the persecution there. So my question is, did Jesus win his election? I would say he did win his election according to Paul.
Jesus definitely prevailed. And
if he would draw, he said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. Then he says, Paul says the powers, if they had known what he was up to, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. But because it's destroying their system. So what I'm suggesting is that infection that you're identifying very astutely is exactly the plan of King Jesus in history, that he's actually hatched a plan that uses nonviolence to dismantle the exertions of wicked power. In the case, he does it on display, and everybody wears a necklace in remembrance.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's easier to interpret what that means historically for the Roman Empire than for our empire, because again, there are so many sort of forms and versions of that message, alive in our world today. It's like you have one interpretation of that, and Pope Francis, if you prefer anti-Pope Francis, it's unclear what his role on that throne is. Has a very different picture
doesn't.
Of that.
Okay.
Let me ask a question. Did you, I don't know how far from your Christianity is this, but did you happen to see the HBO series, The Young Pope?
I saw the first episode, but I didn't finish it. Yeah, but it was interesting from what I saw. Yeah.
It was interesting, and you saw the first episode, and you're like, how did this get made? Because the not to give any spoilers, in this, but at first when I heard about this thing, I was just like, well, this is going to be the most offensive thing that I could possibly imagine, because Hollywood, it's going to be a disaster, right? Actually, it wasn't made in Hollywood; it was made in Italy by this Italian director who's a very very fine art film director, and somehow he makes this film about Jude Law as the like American Pope who wants to restore traditional Catholicism, and in fact, his main mission, which and he's not a villain, and his main mission basically for the whole series is how do we get the homosexuals out of the Catholic Church, right? And so Hollywood is like somehow like and it's done. It really like. It's actually, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Catholic, but I found it that it was actually like. It's seriously engaged with its religious themes. It was not even like a caricature,
right.
And you're just like, where does this come from? And how did this happen? And it didn't win any Emmys or anything like that, which it very very much deserved to. But you see that that's still.
Well, it was made for the same reason The Sopranos was made. It's you have to have an anti-hero to be a cool show on today's Hollywood, right?
Yeah. There's
Han Solo, Tony Soprano, young
There's
Pope.
an element of that, but it's actually, for a little while I'm like, okay, this is an anti-hero, but to some people, I suppose it's an anti-hero, but it's also a little more than an anti-hero, and these are sort of. Like what you realize is, there's this one line where someone is like, claiming they're like, some like business person in the Vatican is like claiming their credentials and is like, she's like, well, and I went to Harvard, and Jude Law is like, well, when I hear the word Harvard, all I can think of is decadence. I'm like, wow, so and you're absolutely right in a way though, because what's motivating this is what makes it work is it's kind of fresh. It's like in a world where one of the problems that this regime has right now is that it's taking these ideas and these thoughts and these perspectives that were incredibly fresh in 1968. And people, wow, I mean, just the freshness of them in the 60s was incredible. Still can't even compare to how fresh they were in the 20s and 30s. Then it was just like the new dawn is coming. It was just like crack straight into your veins, right? And now it's like, sure, can these ideas still take a teenager who is maybe in middle America and has grown up in a fairly traditional background. Maybe she finds kind of boring, and then here's this excitement. She can be all like Black Lives Matter. She can pierce her ears. She can pierce her nose. She can become trans, Is that still exciting to a certain set of people who it hasn't infected yet? Yes, it is. But it's burning through just as that sort of burns into as these ideas, which were once restricted to places like the colleges I went to, kind of burn into mainstream America. I mean, those fires have been burning for a very long time, then they burn out relatively quickly. And what they're left with is this sort of kind of post-revolutionary hangover.
Right.
That was all what the Soviet Union was about.
Well, the reason why I think you see that, though, is because, Christianity is, again, taking from the big helicopter view of history, Christianity would suggest that history is a cover-up, right? That Jesus came to reveal things hidden since the foundation of the world. What are those things that are hidden? He says that Satan is both a liar and a murderer from the beginning. So that society itself, culture itself, language, everything is kind of based on this hidden victim, the immurements that we find all over ancient history, in which human bodies are laid at the cornerstone of new cities and new rivers and new projects of grandeur. The ribbon cutting ceremony, we go to a ribbon cutting ceremony today, and it's like, hey, we're going to have coffee, and look, the mayor's going to get the big scissors. Oh, this is cute. Well, the ribbon cutting ceremony for politics is immurement. It's the ritual human sacrifice of live bodies and cornerstones, And
you can find human sacrifice going back to, certainly in the most ancient Jewish traditions, there starts to be hints of it.
And that's why you just touched on a good point, because that's exactly why when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem and everybody's calling him the king, they're quoting their Bob Dylans. They're saying, look at the prophet saying he's the king. They're quoting, and the guy says, shut up, tell them to be quiet. Tell these guys to shut their mouths. And he says, when these are quiet, the stones will cry out. Now, traditionally in Sunday school America, we're taught that basically means Jesus is swagging out right now. He's basically saying, oh man, you think those guys can be quiet? I'll make the stones sing. Like this is zippity doo dah. You know what I mean? I'm gonna make the stones. I'm Hercules. And so we interpret that. But what he's actually doing, he's quoting another prophet from his tradition, Habakkuk, in which Habakkuk was challenging another wicked king of Israel. And he says, woe to you who founds their city on bloodshed. This is a reference to immurement. This is a reference that goes back way ancient history. And he's saying, wait a second, woe to you who founds the city on bloodshed, because the stones of the walls cry out for justice. It's an attack on the very hidden sacred. And so that's exactly what happens when Jesus is killed the next week. He's killed, and that same crowd that was singing his name, now they're silent, and what happens? The stones of history have been crying out ever since. And that's the infection that I'm referencing. That's why I call it the impotent sacrifice. Because cultures that get the infection of Christianity, they are cursed if they don't fully renounce the thing that Jesus is telling them to renounce. The very thing that his own people failed to renounce in his moment, because he said, "Oh, Jerusalem, if you had only known the ways of peace, but they've been hidden from your eyes." Why have they been hidden? They've been hidden because they're locked in this mimetic hive mind groupthink enclosure of sacred violence. And he's trying to point it out, and he's illustrating it through his actions, through his stories the entire time. And he ultimately exhibits it for history by taking on the form of the scapegoat and unveiling the entire lie. Now, wherever that story goes, it spreads like a mustard seed, slowly, tiny as can be. And it slowly, or if you want to use the reference, it works like yeast through a loaf, and it slowly starts to grow. And where it goes is it breaks down and destroys the sacred institutions of the native host culture that the Christian story goes. One of the first things that primitive societies abandon when they encounter the gospel with missionaries is their sacrificial rituals, their or animal sacrifice, their different patterns that have evolved originally from human sacrifice, cannibalism. And so they understand at a visceral level that we, like you said, we're softened. We're not aware of the visceral reality of society, but these more isolated societies, they viscerally get the radical break, the apocalyptic break that the Christian story is saying. That the idea that you gnaw, the text says, you gnaw on my body, you drink my blood. This is a cannibalistic thing, and it's an attack on the very matrix of meaning that's mediated by the legitimate right to use sacrifice, to sacrifice another, to preserve order and unity, right? And we don't have that anymore. We're falling apart.
And well, yeah, and the question is, when you look at these traditional societies, you look at I had a sort of moment of epiphany about 10 or 15 years ago when I was at a wedding in San Francisco, and it was held in the Presidio in the military chapel, because the bride, I think, had a military background. And you go into the chapel in the Presidio, and there are all these plaques of basically people that have been that were lost in various wars, officers, and around them, and obviously in that place, a lot of them have this interesting phrase, it says where they were lost, and the phrase Japanese Empire occurs frequently. So here you had all these Americans who basically went out, and during this period from basically Commodore Perry to Hiroshima, destroyed this pre-modern civilization that was out there in the North Pacific that actually didn't really want to be destroyed, and it actually didn't even really want it to be contacted. The Japanese before Commodore Perry had this policy of Sakoku, which is to say, okay, we're just going to be here, be Japanese, and we're going to have very minimum commerce with the outside world and no cultural commerce at all. And so if you imagine a world and the desire to sort of infect the rest of the world in the sense that you describe, I think it has, as you're sort of alluding to, it has, a very sort of yeast-like biological quality, and it's a process of creation in some ways and of destruction in others.
That's right.
And
I would
when
say,
you look at
go ahead.
when you look at the specifically, because I sort of grew up in this American empire, which did not style itself at all as a religious construct.
But it is.
And yet, as I read about this in history, I realized that when you have people who call themselves missionaries today, normally they are missionaries, and normally their Christian background is not what you call mainline. It's evangelical, or it's Mormon, it's heterodox in some ways. And this is because the pre-World War II missionary movement, which was a mainline movement, became secularized, and it became the post-World War II foreign aid establishment. And so you see all of these things that today you think of as basically secular, rational, practical policies, like turning Afghanistan into New Jersey, which and if you go back 75 years, the same people that are trying to do this are explicitly Congregationalist,
right?
They're explicitly, and you're like, oh yeah, wow, wasn't Harvard founded as a religious school to begin with? And it's this, you can trace the same line of these Puritans who came to this country, who were Puritanism is so old that it's condemned in Shakespeare, and they came to America and they founded this very godly republic. They were, intensely godly people. They modeled themselves on the Israelites in many ways, and they also had a very Roman quality to them. And you see this in many ways. Although it's Christian, it doesn't have this. It's like Christian in a way that we would find very pagan today.
Right, exactly.
When we talk about the Puritans, when like a normal, not a historian, but just an ordinary person of today says like puritanical, they're what they mean is they mean the ways in which the Puritans seem pagan to them. So to them today, these same mainline Christians, the arguably the most legitimate descendant of the Puritans today, or one of them, is the Unitarian Universalists, right? And that's a straight lineal descent through from Puritanism, Congregationalism, to Unitarianism, and yet you look at these people and you're like, are these are they even Christians in a way that most Christians would recognize? I would say, probably not.
Well, the seculum was a Christian doctrine. It was a Christian invention. The idea of having a secular space. So if you're saying I'm a secularist, you're a Christian. You're just heretically trying to make Christianity something else.
You're yes. You can't say, it's like, English can change a lot, but it can never become not an Indo-European language, because that's where it comes from, right? And you really have to consider, when you consider languages, religions, traditions, you basically, if you're not thinking about where this comes from, you wind up in the same kind of taxonomic hell that you get when you classify a bird and a bat as the same kind of things. So
the issue that I think is there, though, is that, let me ask you a question. What do you think, do you think Jesus, meant something when he said, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword, to cut daughter from mother and to cut, father from son and all that? Because I see that as part of his plan that you and I are a part of right now. Like we're in his fishbowl. We're looking around and we're seeing Antifa daughter against, conservative, John McCain voting mother, and we're seeing this everywhere, right?
We are seeing this everywhere.
So maybe this is intentional. Maybe this is a feature, not necessarily a feature, but an inevitable reality that he predicted would happen when history encountered his project. Do you see what I mean?
I don't know if you've read Joseph de Maistre, who's really the master of theodicy, because we're really talking theodicy here. And Maistre is like, he's not a Frenchman, he's a Savoyard, and so he's writing, but he's obviously a French speaking person. So he's writing in 1797 about the French Revolution, and he's basically like, okay, obviously very completely uncompromising opponent of the French Revolution, and he's like, this is God's plan. Actually, you can clearly see the divine hand in the French Revolution, because what the French Revolution is, the way in which the French Revolution is doing the work of God, is that it is punishing the French who need to be punished. Right. And specifically, if you look at, he's like, oh, you look at all these, people who got their heads cut off, and you're like, they're innocent. He's like, well, you look at the people who actually got their heads cut off, and they're basically the liberals who brought about this revolution.
Right.
I mean, and you're telling me they're innocent? What? And in fact, he sees that revolution as essentially this sort of divine, trial in a way, where you had these people in France who were like, no, France, should be something else. It should be, this atheistic state. And God is like, I'm going to give you what you deserve, which is the guillotine. Yeah. And that's a, I'm not sure I agree with.
Well, I don't agree with that idea either, because I'm not even invoking the idea of theology here. I'm just talking anthropologically still. That
sure.
That it's an inevitable trap. It's an inevitable.
Yes,
it's an inevitable. It's a
trap.
Stumbling block. If a society gets the Christian infection into its aesthetics and its ethics, it's going to work itself through law, through other types of media, and it's going to create this situation in which, if the society continues to try to revivify the sacred in the context of Christianity, that infection will always devour and dismantle and break apart the sacred unity that these practices and rituals in the ancient world would always provide. So, for example, in Afghanistan, you mentioned Afghanistan.
Sure.
And why is it not working? And you mentioned Iraq. And Tom Holland, have you heard of him and his book Dominion, How Christianity Impacted the World? It's really good.
Yeah.
And this historian, he's a secular guy. He reads this, he does this history, and then he's basically converting to Christianity, similar to René Girard, who was a trained historian who studies history, and then from a secular standpoint, he intellectually converts to Christianity before his spiritual conversion. Tom Holland's undergoing the same thing as a historian.
Right.
But both of them notice the same pattern. Tom Holland starts off his book Dominion describing the horror of going on the way to an ancient town in the Roman Empire and seeing babies discarded on the side of the road, left to cry alone. He describes the horror of seeing, fields of people crucified in agony as bones are picked apart and eyeballs are eaten out. And so you look at that and you're like, well, that's a strange world from where we are, right? We're soft. We're worried about concussions for our football players and simulated warfare. You know what I mean? We're totally different from that. What's the impact? What's the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room is the project that Jesus inaugurated. And this isn't about interpretation. This is anthropological. You can see the history of this trajectory. It's like trajectory. It's kind of like looking at the fossil record of texts. You look at the fossil record, you can see the kind of intermediary forms that we're in right now, where the West continues to become haunted by its victims. And so when you talk about the failure of Iraq and Afghanistan, I call that the impotent sacrifice. The idea is, we do not have the stomach to revivify the level of public brutality that the ancient world would do to get people to obey us. So my friend, the Marine veteran I was referencing, he said, David, the things we're trying to do to nation build, these folks don't understand the level of brutality that we need to employ is something we'll never ever have the stomach for. So the idea is, like in Afghanistan, these folks are, these nation builders are trying to tell these folks, hey, you can't stone your daughter for adultery. And the idea is, what level of sacrifice would be required to stop that barbaric practice of stoning a daughter for adultery? And the question would be, you'd have to bring back the full Monty of the ancient world sacrifice. You'd have to have crucifixions on public CNN and C-SPAN. Live stream. This is what America does to you if you try to stone your daughter. This is what America does if you try to vote for, education rights if you don't vote for education rights for women. We are going to crucify you. But they're never going to do it. They're never going to do it.
This is what the British Empire struggled with. This duality, extensively, and they worked out ways to do this that did not quite involve behaving like Genghis Khan, but when we look at those empires, of course, we're like, yeah, British Empire, just like Genghis Khan. Actually, and yeah, they would, there's a famous, saying about, I forget the author of this, I think Macaulay describes it, where the British in India, very, close place to Afghanistan, were abolishing the principle of sati. Do you know what sati is? It's where it's a human sacrifice procedure. It's where the wife of a dead man is burned alive on his funeral pyre. And this was an essential part of various Indian, obviously pre-Christian ritual tropes. And, the governor general or whoever it was, I forget the name of the, said, okay, this is your custom. You can perform this custom. We also have a custom. Our custom is that of hanging murderers. So after you perform your custom, we'll perform ours. And
so that's sacrifice fighting sacrifice, right?
Yeah. Not crucifying them, but certainly hanging them. And the death penalty is of course a highly sacrificial act.
But when is that period? What year is that's happening?
That is the early 1900s.
So what you're doing is you're looking, and this is good, you're going back in the fossil record, and you're looking at texts.
You're going back in the fossil record.
And you're seeing that the infection of Christianity is not as deeply infected. It's stage one right now, or stage two,
Yeah, you're saying that when you look at the British Empire, or when you look at the old Catholic Church, Girard would say, I wouldn't usually put it this way, but it's certainly a way to say it, that there's a substantial amount of paganism and a sort of pagan way of seeing things, and a pagan, essentially, belief in things that are very, very, unchristian, that allows these systems to work.
Right.
So there's a famous book called The Expansion of England, which is actually sort of the Bible of the late British Empire, by a guy named John Seeley, written Seeley, written in the late 19th century. And there's this famous passage in it where he's looking at the Raj, the British Empire in India, and he's like, what's really strange is that we in England we completely understand the science of government. We're all classical liberals, or he wouldn't use that term, but, he's like, we all believe in Manchester economics and free trade and, all of these things. And then you go to India and you find this regime that is funded by taxes on oil and salt. Why is this regime funded by taxes on oil and salt? It's because the British in India did not, export British methods of government directly to India. Instead, they combine British methods with the existing Mughal Empire. And so, the reason these taxes exist is these are Mughal taxes. And in fact, if you look objectively at the history of India in the 20th century, you see that so-called independent India is actually much more foreign, and you would say much more Christian, than the Raj that replaced it. So in the process of becoming, independent, India is like, oh, well, I see the new, we have to all be Fabians, the Fabian society. We need all this bureaucracy. We need all these civil servants. They developed, this horrendous system of government that in India is called the permit Raj, meaning that you need, 17, stamps from 17 bureaucrats that you have to bribe to do anything. And so they imposed this system, in the name of independence. They imposed this system which was culturally much more foreign to India and which worked generally worse. But it was staffed by Indians rather than by British people. And so, again, what you're seeing that these sort of old pagan systems that were essentially necessary to govern a certain kind of person were like, to govern pagan societies and people who lived and believed in those ways, just worked, and the replacements didn't.
That's right.
Now,
that's why Japan kept Christianity at bay as much as possible, because they were a highly functioning scapegoat mechanism derived society, and they know very viscerally that Christianity will muck it all up, will destroy the whole thing.
Yeah. They could see that it was a revolution, and they repressed it, very brutally.
India was not as lucky because of where they were.
India was not as lucky, and Japan would have been much more effectively brought into the modern world after 1940. Japan is still the most alien country on earth in many ways, and that the aspects of Japan that are sort of deeply Japanese only survive basically because of one man, who was Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur was from MacArthur's father had been the Governor General of the Philippines, Arthur MacArthur. So MacArthur was really a colonialist. And the old sort of, before 1950, the conflict in global affairs was always between the missionaries and the colonialists, the people who came to those parts of the world to settle, to engage in commerce. Those were one kind of person, and the missionaries were another kind of person, and the missionaries won. But MacArthur's culture was that of the settlers and the colonialists, and that's why he left so much of Japanese culture intact.
Right.
But that's sort of the exception that proves the rule in some ways. And the thing that we would have if we still had Tokugawa Japan untouched today in this world, it would just be this incredible museum piece, which has been largely destroyed.
Well, Papua New Guinea is an example that gives you some differentiation you can look at.
Yes, although I think Papua New Guinea is very different from Japan.
Well, yes, but one of the things that's interesting about Papua New Guinea is that I've had this woman call into my radio show live on talk radio, the same station.
Is she a missionary?
No, she's a woman that is from Papua New Guinea. She's a native of that island, and so in Papua New Guinea, I interacted with her because she was being accused of sorcery, and she was not guilty of that. But in Papua New Guinea, because it's preserved in amber, a more pre-Christian approach. They haven't had Christianity infected as long and as deeply. And so they still practice, if a child dies, if a woman yawns wrong, they'll say, "Oh, a spirit came out," and they'll use that as the occasion to try to burn her alive. And they were trying to burn Monica, but Monica refused to leave. So she stayed in the neighborhood, and she's Christian, and she would fight to get women safe whenever they were being accused. And I was like, "Monica, you got to get out of there." I mean, she said she got hurt one time, and one time, I mean, she was right on air, and there was like people that night or the day before who were like pounding on her door trying to look for her to see where her women that she was hiding.
Papua New Guinea is a gnarly place.
Right. So here's my point. And I said, so where did this come from? She says, it's this idea called jealous. It's this idea of deep-seated resentment, like a Nietzschean almost. And the idea is that when you have, she said that because of the influence of Western, capitalism and Christianity coming in, it allows for some aspirational development because there's technology and there's clothes and there's, modern industries that people could be a part of. And it stokes a lot of jealousy. And so it's almost like the introduction of Christianity and flickers a flare-up of more brutal, older forms of keeping the peace, which is if jealousy and envy is running amok, you stamp it out with sacrifice, and you target the person who is a recipient of the relative wealth advantage that Western jobs and Western trade are providing.
Oh, yeah.
And so she was saying that, she said, they're really stoking attacks against me because they're jealous of my property, that I have a property, they want it. So they're trying to call me a witch, incite a mob, burn me, and take my property. They're jealous. And this is inflamed because of the presence of Christianity. So you can look like looking through that fossil record of historical texts and experiences and see right now that they're going through a transformation that many other cultures, like ancient Germans and ancient, Norse culture, had to deal with a long time ago. But you can see that conflict of two worlds colliding, and they have to rely on the state to try to mediate with police these tribal conflicts so that they don't stumble into a burning.
The state in Papua New Guinea is this, decrepit post-Australian weird colonial thing,
right?
That barely functions.
But they're doing the same thing that, like you were talking about. You know what I mean? We're going to hang you if you kill this person, like you said in India. You know what I mean? Or burn this woman.
Yeah. Well, let's. I mean, we've talked about the problem. A fair bit, as a Girardian, maybe you deny that there are solutions. I actually think that there are solutions to this problem, but they're just more radical than anyone is ready to conceive of. One of the funny things in this world, of course, is that you may know of this phenomenon called Star Trek, which is not a very conservative or Christian thing as most people think of it.
Right.
But I mean, it's straight out a product of good old classic American communism. But they came up with this interesting idea, which I don't know if you're familiar with the Star Trek canon, which is the Prime Directive, which is a very different. It's sort of the opposite of the missionary interpretation of U.S. foreign policy,
Right.
where it basically says, leave these societies intact. So if you look at, for example, this is done in certain places in the modern world, there are still uncontacted tribes. And so one thing that people have realized, although it goes against sort of all of their ideological preconceptions, is that Sentinel Island, right, is the most famous one of these, where you have these, but there are also uncontacted tribes in the Amazon and Brazil. And the rule has been, okay, let's actually treat them in this Prime Directive way.
Mm-hmm.
Let's basically say, you know what, we're not going to contact these people. We're not going to have them sitting around smoking dope in dirty soccer shorts. We're going to let them live the way that they live. And if they see a helicopter, they're going to shoot at it with their bows and arrows. And, that's probably what they should be doing. That is so
you're trying to
missionary...
save them from the birth pains that Paul talks about in the New Testament.
I'm trying to save them from the birth pains. I'm just saying, you're not ready for this. And so when you look at, for example, a situation like Afghanistan, now Afghanistan is by no means North Sentinel Island. On the other hand, one of the reasons why American troops can't leave Afghanistan is simply that we have no intellectual picture of what it would even mean to abandon part of the world and to say, this is not ours anymore, this is its own. And, what Western influence would be replaced by is either you'd have some other power that came in and tried to do the empire thing. I mean, my God, do you know who has a border with Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm.
China.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, you know what? Hey, you want to take on some responsibilities over there? You're filling some oats. You've got a big budget surplus. Free, absolutely free. We'll just put it on the curb with a little sign on it saying it's yours. But
that would be. Wait a second. That would be being very pagan of us, and we can't do that. We can't abandon our baby. We're like an overbearing mother. It's our little baby.
Afghanistan is ours, and even though we're abusing this baby and we don't even know what to feed the baby, and it's clearly
lots of soy and Coca-Cola.
Lots of soy and Coca-Cola, and so we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to say, okay, we're gonna take a step back and admit that this has failed. And the irony of it is that here's another thing that most people wouldn't really identify as a Christian phenomenon, which is Burning Man. And so if you go to Burning Man, they have a government of sorts, but obviously everyone is equal. There's no money. They're actually living very much in the manner of one of the little communities that Paul might have sent one of his emails to. It's a little their morals are not what Paul would have wanted.
They even respect their pagan roots by burning a mock human sacrifice, right? Not a real human sacrifice. As far as we know, I don't know.
It's definitely a mock human sacrifice. I think it did fall over on someone once, but it's mostly a mock human sacrifice. But of course, these are all the descendants of Christians and to some extent, Jews. I mean, if you see pictures of Burning Man, it's whiter than any Klan meeting you've ever encountered. I mean, it is a white event, and here are these people basically living out their living what could only be described as an ideal of Christian brotherhood. I mean, there's no money. Everyone is everyone else's friend, and very little government is required. And so the idea of, okay, we're going to turn Afghanistan into Burning Man, feels it's a no-brainer to people. Oh, we have a new country to govern. Let's govern it right. Let's forget all this stuff from the past. And the irony is, of course, that if it is even possible to turn Afghanistan into Burning Man, it requires a level of force and violence and pagan behavior that is very comparable to that of the British Empire. In fact, the British Empire had a very simple way of dealing with Afghanistan. They were like, okay, these people are genuinely crazy. What we're going to do is we're going to basically find one of them. He's going to be the king. He's going to be the only one we sell arms to. And the deal is going to be, and this actually worked very well. The deal is going to be very simple. You know, you do what you want. You're the only one we sell guns to. If you continue your traditional practice of raiding across the frontier into India, hell will descend on you. So don't do that. Other than that, do whatever you want. And that worked, you know. And that probably should have been a little closer to the approach taken with the Taliban. But this goal of sort of this missionary goal of transforming Afghanistan into the kingdom of Christ on earth was impossible to resist.
Because it takes a lot of roots to create the tree of what they want Afghanistan to take.
Yeah, and those roots have to be planted with shovels and picks, and you're
and there's a lot of and there's a lot of deconstruction of text that has to happen in the culture, in the aesthetics of a culture that we take for granted because we have amnesia. We don't want to believe that the way we think about victims and the other are heavily Christianized. No, that's Enlightenment. No, it's not. It's way deeper than that.
No.
And so we just think we can like fast forward or microwave that entire 2,000-year infection of the West. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the you know, obviously we're going to have a difference of opinion in how to solve this problem because you're a Christian and I'm not. And so you know, my solution to it is, you know, simply involves a lot of what you might call paganism, but it involves a very structured and controlled use of pagan tropes. And so I think that, you know, it's like when people look at Nazi Germany, for example, there's a couple of things, you know, first of all, you'll see, you know, that it's very, very pagan in, you know, almost a lot of explicit ways. I mean, you know, the Nazis claim to have, you know, they're like, we're all German Christians now, you know, and they invented this German, you know, Christian church. I think actually one of the astounding things about World War II is that it was the first conflict in which all of the leaders privately were atheists.
Right.
You know, Hitler certainly did not have any Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not even start with Stalin. You know, and FDR basically believed in FDR. But certainly when you look at Nazi Germany, it's sort of the most pagan of all of these states.
Right.
And the thing is that the mistake that's made, and, you know, that has sort of continued to be made by basically followers of that tradition, is that their paganism is poorly chosen, because it's chosen essentially to shock and horrify. It's chosen from those elements of paganism that are most shocking to Christians, in a way, and it acquires its energy. It has this energy. I mean, you feel intuitively that, you know, Hitler has become the figure of Antichrist in our time, and, you know, and there's substance to that, because the figure of Antichrist that's presented in Revelation is both the sort of mimicking of Christ and this opposite of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you see one of the interesting facts, sort of historical, not spiritual, just factual historical facts about the early part of the 20th century, is that in World War I, the Germans are accused of all of these atrocities, which they're not in fact committing. There was this whole lie of this atrocity propaganda. The Germans were described as these Huns. You know, in fact, they had a somewhat pagan view of the laws of war, but they really weren't Nazis. They weren't behaving like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so here you have these false accusations, which is just like sort of classic media lies, essentially. And they worked very much the same way that media lies worked in our time. But after World War I, these lies are exposed. And it's like, no, actually, German soldiers were not cutting off the breasts of Belgian women with their bayonets.
Right.
Like, this was all just like a lie. There was none of this Hun behavior.
Yeah.
And so the consequence of these lies, the devil, of course, is the father of lies. And the consequence of these lies was that, first of all, when the Holocaust was actually happening in World War II, it was not useful as propaganda because the Allies couldn't just repeat their World War I propaganda because it'd be like, oh, yeah, I see, that'll trick again, right? And on the other side, though, what happened was even worse, which was that Germans were essentially presented with a kind of Manichaean duality where it was like, okay, either you're going to be good liberals and accept this just shit that we've laid on you, like the Treaty of Versailles and all of this, like, oh, we're going to give you an equal peace. Oh, wait, we're not. We're going to starve you after the war. All of this just like really brutal and just shameless treatment. And if you say, okay, I'm going to turn the other cheek, I'm going to respond to this with love, I'm going to be a loving member of the international community, you're a liberal. And then, okay, suppose I'm like not going to let myself be humiliated in that way. What am I going to be? Well, the opposite of a liberal is a Hun, so I'm going to be a Hun. And so you have this kind of almost this inverse mimesis where basically the Germans, a substantial percentage of the German people reject this sort of very Christian liberal way to be, and they embrace its opposite, which had started as a fictional caricature, but doesn't stay in the world of fiction.
So they said, you want me to be the monster, I'll be the monster. I'll be the scapegoat you've been looking for.
I'll be the monster. Yeah. I'll be the, I'm the scapegoat you're looking for, right? It's like, oh, but, right, and so they monster up, and that creates, like, they become the scapegoat. They inhabit the scapegoat. And they make the scapegoat, realer than it could possibly be. And it's so real that it's still being used to frighten children to this day. And not only is it being used to frighten children, it has this, this is the same thing as happening to 15-year-olds all across America today, where they basically, you have some smart kid, he goes to school and he just gets full of this, just like, smarmy nonsense. And, then he's like, well, what is the opposite of this smarmy nonsense? And the answer is Sig Heil, and he's at that point he becomes an internet Nazi. And he embraces, the scapegoat. And the thing is, the scapegoat is, of course, doomed, right? That's the purpose of the scapegoat, is to have its head cut off. And you see, this phenomenon sort of giving all of this strength and life to these kind of really, really dark forces, and dark forces on both sides. And so you're just like, how do you escape from this kind of pattern of what's really pathological mimesis?
Right. And because it's in the Christian fishbowl, so people are always coveting the martyr's perch. So wherever they see a community being scapegoated, it creates this kind of bizarre attraction towards it because we're so Christian. So it's like, oh, those guys are the untouchable evil guys? Well, I think there's a conspiracy behind that accusation. I think maybe they are the good guys. So they jump towards that
maybe
underdog.
Maybe they are the good guys, right? And the thing is that, of course, when you look at any sort of real cause, you'll see that the people in it are fighting for some, vision of the good. So then you look at the Nazis and you find the element of that is a vision of the good, and you're like, okay, Hitler did nothing wrong. And actually you've already doomed yourself there because in fact Hitler did do something wrong. Mm-hmm. So you've basically occupied a position that's very, very hard to defend. And, so...
He did something wrong by what standard and who's the king? And I know who that king is, right? Which king standards are we judging here? You gotta, you can't appeal to the brotherhood of man now. You have to, because there has to be something bigger than us, right? That's my thing.
By Genghis Khan's standards, did he do anything wrong? I don't know. By Genghis Khan's standards, he lost, so he did something wrong.
Right.
And so escaping from that sort of pattern for me comes from, okay, like, you know, it's like, how do you escape from the 20th century? Well, you know, your first task is to even want to escape from the 20th century. And when I look at our consciousness of history,
right,
it's like if you look inside a person's brain, there's what's called a homunculus, which is a map of your whole body on the cortex of your brain. But the map is not evenly shaped because you have many more neurons going to parts of your body that are, you know, sort of used a lot, like your hands. And so the shape of the homunculus is like your hands are the size of your whole body, basically on this neural pattern. Because obviously there's a lot of nerves going to the hands and not so many going to like your thighs, right? So when we look at history, what we see, or sort of our homunculus of history, the present is enormous, the recent present is huge, and then like the 16th century might as well not have happened, you know? And in reality, of course, those centuries were just as long, and they weren't as heavily populated, I guess. They were just as long as ours, and they were just as interesting as ours, and the people in them were just as human as ours. And so when you say, for example, okay, the U.S. has economic problems, clearly has many economic problems because, you know, my God, just drive around it. And you're like, okay, the U.S. has economic problems, and there's a range of economic solutions from Marxism on the one end to libertarianism on the other end. And what you're not seeing when you see that is that in an absolute historical context, Marxism and libertarianism are like second cousins because they both come out of...
They're Cain and Abel.
They're Cain and Abel, right? You know, they're Cain and Abel. They're in the same family, right? You know, and they both come out of, they both have this sort of telos of progress. They're both, you know,
they're both Christian or Christian denominations or heresies, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, they both come out of 19th century Christian thought. They both have this kind of utopian, you know, telos. You know, they both want the state to wither away. You know, and I mean, libertarianism, as we know it today, is really the intellectual construction, almost overwhelmingly, of one man, Murray Rothbard, who took these ideas that had, you know, survived in the hands of people like Mises, and took, you know, historical ideas from the mid-19th century of classical liberalism, which were, by the way, leftist ideas in that time, and turned them into a kind of new anti-government creed for the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century. You know, brilliant work, but you're still operating within a relatively small fishbowl,
right?
Because your fishbowl is really that of Anglo-American thought. I mean, yes, was Marx a German Jew? He was a German Jew. He was a German Jew who became an English gentleman and wrote all his works in the British Library.
And let's face it, libertarianism doesn't appeal to the gut. It doesn't get you at that visceral aesthetic level, does it?
It doesn't, and that's really, I mean, you know, it has both practical flaws and philosophical flaws. It's an amazing work. I've read all of Rothbard, I think. There might be some Rothbard I haven't read. I've read all of Mises. You know, these are amazing thinkers, but ultimately, I think today we have to view them as kind of part of history rather than transcending history. Now, Rothbard, you know, for example, this is one Rothbard that I actually haven't read. I've skimmed some of it, which is he wrote a whole textbook on economics before Adam Smith. And, you know, his goal was not to praise economics before Adam Smith, but, you know, Rothbard always has an axe to grind. Every Rothbard book is always, you know, you've read Conceived in Liberty, his, you know, wonderful book full of but he always has that. He's always on the side of, and it's funny, you're reading this and he's always on the side of the mob,
right,
basically, in Conceived in Liberty. And you know, these are some fairly scurrilous mobs. I mean, you know, these are mobs that make the Tea Party look gentle, and the Tea Party was not gentle, you know. And so
but Kierkegaard would say the crowd is untruth, so it's a little bit of a tension there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tension there, and you know, this is a guy like, you know, Rothbard flirted with like supporting the like Black Panthers in his own time and so forth. He's a great character, but I wouldn't regard him as a holy prophet. He's just a brilliant intellectual. But my point about economics is that if you look at America's economic problems, I would say that Marxism and libertarianism maybe both have certain kinds of band-aids to offer, but these are problems that Queen Elizabeth I's economists would have no trouble in solving, because the problems are essentially the recipe that pre-Adam Smith economists would apply would be what we now know as mercantilism, which is also, of course, how China. You might notice that everything you use is made in China. This is also so I had speaking of mercantilism, I had a funny interaction a few years ago, which is I was going out to dinner with a friend who was a Chinese friend. And this is a Chinese, unlike most Chinese people in Silicon Valley, this is a guy who'd gone to college in China and then come to Berkeley for grad school. So he was a startup founder. He's a startup founder, very, very sharp guy, but very Chinese, and he's actually connected in China. He's he and his wife are both from party families. So, we're talking about this and that and, all sorts of things. And, we start to talk about economics. And I mention the name of probably the best, writer. He's really, even back then, a neo-mercantilist, which is a guy named Friedrich List, who was a German who was writing in the 1840s. Now, this is someone who, he's not taught by Marxists, he's not taught by libertarians. This is someone who was outside, not necessarily the Christian fishbowl, but certainly the fishbowl of Anglo-American liberal world thinking, right? This is someone who basically no one has read. But amazing writer, very cogent in a lot of ways. And, it's not that I think that libertarian economics is wrong. It's just a limited subset of the truth.
I think I agree with you. Yeah.
And it's like Newtonian mechanics. It's absolutely right within its own domain, but outside of its domain, it falls apart. And this is exactly what, List points out with relation to Adam Smith. He's like, look, if you take Adam Smith's core assumptions, Adam Smith is exactly right. But if you look at his core assumptions, one of the things he's assuming is that countries aren't real. And if you treat countries as real, you get totally different equations. And so anyway, I'm talking to this Chinese guy mentioning Friedrich List, and he's like, oh, Friedrich List, Friedrich List. And it turns out that everybody in China knows Friedrich List. I thought they just made this stuff up, but apparently that is not the case. They've actually, they've taken this little piece of culture that we've forgotten, and it's not seat of the pants mercantilism. They know perfectly well what they're doing, and what they're doing, you can't argue is, your own eyes will tell you that what they're doing is very, very effective. And we simply don't have the intellectual capital to play that game back or to compete in that game, which would actually be extremely easy and effective for this country. I mean, when you have a country that's running a massive trade deficit and you basically say, okay, instead of sending money to other countries to make things, we're going to send money to Americans to make things, you get an instant economic boom. I mean, it's just that's just math, right? And our inability to handle sort of this just math sort of shows us how narrow that sort of fishbowl of modernity is, because we'd assumed that these modern ideas just sort of came along with technology. Well, China has the technology, but they also don't feel any need to practice libertarian or Marxist economics. They seem quite comfortable in practicing this kind of economics that we've forgotten completely. You could even call it pagan economics.
I would say though that you've got 200 million Christians in China, perhaps, and you've got globalism exporting Christian-derived aesthetics. So China's day's coming.
I know what you're going to say.
They're going to have their infection. Yeah. They're just earlier in their stage than we are. So don't look too excited.
That's really very true. I think it's going to come probably more through the globalist
Well, they
side
work nice
than
in hand because you got that grassroots underground Christianity that will get its power
but
by being crucified culturally. You see what I mean?
The grassroots, the Chinese Christians tend to be very, relatively traditional Christians. They're not on which means in your parlance, relatively pagan Christians. They're not on so much the the bubbling acidic edge that globalism is on.
Well, 1600 Christians were too in Europe, but they would burn heretics, but they still destroyed a lot of their structures of power.
Yeah,
you see what I mean?
yeah. No, I'm not saying. I'm just saying that in China specifically, those things are pretty separate. I would still expect the global China has not dealt with that problem.
Right.
So, the Chinese leaders send their children to school at Harvard. Harvard is like this huge brand. The power of that brand name in China is incredible. I'm surprised they haven't had Black Lives Matter, protests in China. Well, I guess I'm not, but but they would.
And that's
right?
where they're going to learn the subversion of the scapegoat. They're going to learn to be sensitive to the victim, which is going to undermine the order of China eventually.
And it's going to undermine the order of China. That's absolutely right. And one of the difficulties that really I struggle with in this project of understanding, okay, what is a vision of the 21st century that actually works, is that it's very, very difficult. My cultural background and the way I see things can really all be described sort of very literally as postmodern and post-liberal. And so I'm like, okay, sort of what comes next? I've sort of culturally completely passed through the fires of modernity, as a lot of people have. And so the problem is that from my perspective, when I admire things that are pre-modern, like China is really very pre-modern, and in many ways it has not passed through. It passed through the fire of Maoism, but that had a lot of roots in Western ideology. But it was always, it was like the Taiping Rebellion, which wasn't really Christian.
Yeah. And still blatantly sacrificial. The struggle sessions.
Still blatantly set, yeah, right. And so, it's sort of passed through this Maoist experience, but it's still very much a pre-modern country, and its strength comes from its kind of pre-modern energy, and that pre-modern energy is very free from irony. The Chinese are not an ironic people at all.
Mm-hmm.
Go and watch the New Year's gala that they do every year. It's like Vegas times 100.
Right.
You can see it on YouTube. Not even slightly ironic, right? And the difficulty is really, you're like, okay, much of the world sort of still feels this force, but trying to get it sort of have it pass through those fires or that yeast and have it survive and become this postmodern thing is a very difficult thing to imagine.
Right.
It's hard for, one of the things that you see is that when pre-modern, pagan, if you will, ways of thinking resist the modern world, they don't do so effectively because they don't even have the sort of the terms to understand it. So, for example, in World War II, one thing that, even a schoolboy can notice is, wow, if Japan, instead of attacking the U.S., attacks the Soviets at the same time as the Germans do, the Axis win the war. Why don't they do this? It seems obvious. Why did the Japanese, basically go out and attack the U.S., which serves no military purpose and is a war they can't win, instead of just actually allying with the Germans and helping them conquer Eurasia? And the answer to this question has to come from the psychologies of these regimes. And the psychology of of all of the fascist regimes was never that they were fighting for, as we were, for an international fascist community or a fascist world. They were all fighting for basically not the unipolar order or the bipolar order with the Soviets that we saw develop, but that wasn't the plan. They were never fighting for a unipolar fascist order. They were fighting for their own national independence in what they conceived as a sort of the old multipolar order. So, to them, these are wars of national independence.
Yeah, it's
so
a
that,
war
the
between
axis,
it's a war between polytheists and monotheists.
yes, exactly. And so the idea of that, the Axis is a press release. There's never any like real military coordination there. It's just like, oh, we're doing this thing that's kind of like you. Maybe we should but they don't understand each other. They're not on the same page. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, which have their differences during that war, are far more on the same page than the Germans and the Japanese, which are both these like aggressive, super Spartan, scapegoat states, basically. And of course, Italy doesn't even make it through the war, and it's just like, it's this, the whole thing is this sort of enormous tragedy because, you see that they're fighting for national independence, and I sort of believe abstractly in national independence. They don't know how to do it. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand their enemy at all. They do this crazy, insane thing of saying, oh, our enemies are controlled by the Jews, so we'll take all the Jews hostage and then kill them. Which doesn't work at all militarily, setting aside, how evil and unchristian it is. It simply doesn't work.
Right.
And, and actually both sides go in for this like very pagan strategy of like attacking enemy civilians. Totally fails. Strategic city bombing, which both sides practiced, although, we did it more and better, was supposed to decrease the morale of the, people who were bombed. Hitler's like, oh, if I bomb London, the British will realize that they don't want to have a war with us, right? He bombs London, and the British are like, after this sacrifice, we must totally destroy Hitler, right? He totally doesn't get it. And, and of course the German people do the same thing. We, burned their cities and, killed 250,000 German civilians, and they're like, we must fight to the death for Germany, right? And these sacrifices are totally they have this wanton quality because they're not actually militarily effective. And
interesting, yeah.
And that that's sort of this, when Caesar would go and kill 100,000 Gauls or whatever, he would do that for a reason, and it would work, and one of the sort of the things about these sort of Christian empires, or this way of seeing the world that we have now, it's like, you look at our attempts to build an empire in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever, and just as you can sort of trace this decay again, where let's say in the Spanish-American War. Yeah, and that's really a classic imperialist war because it has this aspect of this, oh, we're going to free the Cubans. The Cuban revolutionaries are being, horribly abused. Actually, the word concentration camp comes from Spanish policies in Cuba in the late, 19th century. They weren't death camps. They were just, let's move the population. So, because to win the guerrilla war, the British did this in South Africa. Totally normal thing to do. Probably was done with some level of brutality. So the American press is like, oh, we'll free the Filipinos from their brutal Spanish, Catholic overlords. A lot of anti-Catholicism at this time, going into the sort of the revolutionary thing. And then, we free these countries, and we're like, oh, we have these delicious countries. How about some commerce? And so you basically acquire this empire in this kind of fit of moralizing, which is very somewhat hypocritical moralizing, but, meant deeply sincerely. And then you have this empire, and life is good because you have this empire. And okay, the Filipinos are still causing some trouble.
Yeah, Mark Twain has that famous prayer, about the Filipinos.
The
Spanish-American War.
Sitting in darkness. Yeah, right. And so Mark Twain, who's very much a liberal of his time, liberals have only been getting worse since Mark Twain. And he finds this. The hypocrisy is incredible because we've purported to be doing this for these Christian reasons, but we're actually doing it for these pagan reasons, right? For commerce and power and glory and, all these imperial things. But the point is, and the British, of course, we learned all of this from the British. Is the famous saying about the British Empire that they acquired an empire in a fit of absent-mindedness. Well, it was It was productive absent-mindedness, because you got these countries, and then like there's all this commerce and trade and all these good stuff, right? So, when you look at this sort of imperialism, you can say, well, is this predatory? Well, yeah, it's somewhat predatory. But it's predatory in like a sort of healthy wolf-like way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, here's this blonde beast, whatever the imperialist, he goes out, he kills the deer, and then he eats the deer. And the deer is actually good, and this is the cycle of life. He's this wolf eating this tasty deer. And what you get in the 20th century becomes, with the practical pagan impulses decrease, and the kind of philosophical Christian impulses increase. And so what you get is more like, there's a line... I forget where I saw this, but it was like it was a Belgian colonist in the Congo after the U.S. basically overthrew the Belgian Empire, which is not what you'll read in the history books. You also won't read in the history books, although it's also true that the Congo between King Leopold and 1960 was a huge smashing success, and. So here's this Belgian, and he's basically like, he makes this line. He's like, look, the Congo is a great place. I love the Congo. I understand why the U.S. wants to take the Congo from us. Believe me, I get that. What I don't understand is why they want to take it from us and burn it down. And which is actually, of course, what happened. And so what you have where sort of when these kind of practical pagan impulses of imperialism disappear is it's more like, it's not a wolf, it's more like a dog. And the dog, okay, he's descended from wolves. He has all these wolf, instincts, etc. He likes to chase things. He likes to kill things. You let a bad pit bull into a paddock full of sheep. He'll kill all the sheep, and then he'll come home for his dog food, right? He doesn't even know what would it be to eat these things. He just knows that it's fun to kill them, right? And so the sort of the more recent, periods of our kind of Christian imperialism, whether it's ending all of these colonial structures or trying to conquer Iraq and Afghanistan, have this quality of a dog killing sheep, where it's like you conquered this country because it was fun, I guess. Like, what are you doing? What are you trying to, and there are sort of all these conspiracy theories where, the U.S. is trying to get the mineral resources of Afghanistan or whatever. And I'm like, if the U.S. was actually trying to get the mineral resources of Afghanistan, it would be doing something sensible. It would be doing something, but instead it's just like this sort of purely performative activity, and very much like the dog killing sheep. And, indeed, a lot of blood is shed in this way.
Well, you know what it looks like to me?
It
looks like the ant that gets that mushroom infection, and then it just sprouts out mushrooms out of its head.
Yeah.
It's a zombie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's a zombie. And
we're a zombie empire.
We're a zombie empire, and when you have some like zombie policies don't really there's a lot of things like the U.S. is like strategic mohair fund or whatever from like the mohair shortage in 1916. Some things like that just keep on and you don't really notice them. They're fine. They just waste some money. But when you have a zombie war, you look at that and you're just like, that is really weird. And, this generations, starting to be generations of Americans, like patriotic Americans from like good, like small towns, like go off and they're like, oh, I'm going to join the military and defend America. And then they find themselves just involved in this complete craziness. And, I think that, a lot of things that have happened in 2020, have been bad. They've sort of been bad in immediate ways. But I also think that when I look at sort of, Americans out there in, sort of the historic, middle America, or like, where I am right now is very much in Trump country. And I'm just like, these people they're only beginning to grasp how sort of strange and foreign this government in Washington is, and how much it sort of despises them and wants to destroy them. And you can't emphasize that too much.
Well, that's what I do. I engage in Heartland Talk Radio, Rush Limbaugh stations with this message that I'm saying now. So I think it is starting to. There's an opening for this kind of thought.
There's an opening. There's an opening there, and I think during, like many Americans, I'm perhaps somewhat disappointed in the Trump revolution or the Trump self-promotion.
Well, I call it, I always said it was like a hair band, 1980s hair band reunion tour. It's got big stadiums, packs big stadiums, but it's a reunion tour. Yeah. It's old. They're not going to be doing this forever.
It's not real. And it has this quality of like, you look at what's happening there and you're like, something real caused this, but this is not real. I would like to see more of the real thing that caused this, but you're fundamentally looking at 20th century TV show celebrity politics, right? Mm-hmm. And, there's a world, one of the ironies about electing, Donald Trump is that somehow Americans managed to find the only CEO who was not a competent manager. And because the Trump organization it was a licensing firm. It was basically a branding. It was always a PR exercise, right? And so you have, here's this person who actually doesn't really know how to run anything, and worse, doesn't know how to delegate to people who do know how to run things. FDR is a very similar figure to Trump in some ways, in that he has the same kind of charisma. He's not a detail man. But FDR was from the highest level of American high society. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't have any insecurities, and he just delegated his power to people who could actually get things done. Trump is obviously mostly incapable of getting anything done, and also incapable of delegating, to anyone except Jared Kushner.
Well, I'm going to have to cut it here, but I really enjoyed this discussion, and I want to let you have a final thought and plug your project, because I want to leave it with this kind of open-ended thought. Okay, so people can go to your website. My question, we still haven't got quite to the solution, and I know that you got to go to graymirror.substack.com to find out, right? So we're not going to give away the spoilers completely, but I'll just leave this thought, and you can respond, and we'll call it a wrap for now, and pick it up another time maybe. But here's my thought. Sure. So my idea is, you've made a very great analysis of history, but to me it seems like it's clear that in the battle between Christ versus Caesar, Christ is winning, but he wins precisely the way he wins in history, which is by allowing Caesar a kind of Aikido dismantling of Caesar's power. And so, you've described that, your solution has some pagan elements, and I'd be interested to see what those are, because in the battle between those who imitate the pagan values and those who imitate Christian values, even though they use them in bad ways, in evil ways, it seems like it's clear that Christianity is cleaning the pagans' clocks. It kind of like, so when I hear, let's go borrow from paganism, I hear, well, let's go borrow from the Washington Generals as they battle the Harlem Globetrotters. It's like, no, they're losing every game. They're there to be dunked on at this point. Now, that's not a Christian triumphalism, and it doesn't mean that we put a stamp on liberalism as that's the way to go. No, it's the opposite of that. It's exactly what you said. Christianity defeats Caesar by destroying it from within once its story infects the society long enough to work its way through a full metastatic destruction of the violence. And so here's my thing. My thing is, to me, you sound like a Christian in the way you analyze these things. You're a globalist. To me, it seems like the only answer is to try to navigate how to understand the kingship of Christ. You're looking for monarchs. Well, we have one, yes. And we better get on board with following his rules, or else we're going to continue to have a cursed society that falls apart.
Well, yes. I mean, the irony of the idea of Christ as king. Someone recently, I don't know if this is too close to your Christianity. Someone recently gave me a copy of do you know the writer Arthur Pink? He's a hardcore Calvinist from around the 1920s, who wrote this wonderful book called The Sovereignty of God. Absolutely recommend that. And yes, as a non-Christian, I would recommend that to everyone. Your Christianity may differ a little bit from this extreme level of Calvinism, but the elements of what we see when we see historical Christianity is we see that the systems that have survived the best tend to be this sort of intricate weave of Girardian Christianity with what you could easily call paganism. So obviously the Catholic Church is a huge example of that because they still call the Pope the Pontifex Maximus, right? That's a pagan title. And so it has this kind of this deeply woven sort of pagan understanding. Likewise, when you look at the world of the Puritans, you also see this sort of form of paganism. I think the form.
What do you mean by paganism? Are you talking about order and hierarchy?
What do I mean?
Hierarchy?
Order and hierarchy, in a way, order, hierarchy, and even sacrifice, and so.
What kind of sacrifice? Sacrifice of another or self-sacrifice?
Well, is there ultimately a huge difference?
That's the question of Christianity.
I mean, largely self-sacrifice. But there's an ability in the pagan. Again, my personal guru and my favorite writer is this guy Thomas Carlyle. And if you're completely new to Thomas Carlyle and you're a Christian, the work I would recommend most is something that was very poorly received in his own days, which is a book called The Latter-day Pamphlets. They were actually published as pamphlets. And Carlyle was brought up a very strict Scotch Calvinist, and then had a crisis of faith. And then, he was also somewhat of an Enlightenment guy. He was friends with John Stuart Mill, and then sort of recovered a kind of religion that really went beyond his own day in some ways. And so he's reacting in one of the Latter-day Pamphlets, which is, I believe, called Model Prisons. He's reacting on kind of this new pro-criminal idea of justice that is, has certainly come to our streets and towns. He takes on the question of, is it Christian, to hang a murderer? And, he believes that it's actually a very Christian thing to do. But is that a sacrifice of others? That is absolutely a sacrifice of others. And the case that he makes for that sacrifice, in a Christian sense is, I think, that in your analysis, one that, while you're not necessarily denying his orthodoxy, it has a pagan tone to it. And so those, that interweaving of those forces is very essential to all successful civilizations. And what we're seeing is that our civilization is becoming not a very successful one. Mm-hmm. And the way of restoring that, most people think that the only alternatives are to kind of continue on the path that we're on, which we see exactly where it leads, or to kind of go full pagan in this Nazi manner, right? And really just to oppose, to become Antichrist. And I can understand the people who, both of those tendencies, I think, are very sort of deeply emotionally rooted and deeply sound. And yet, when we look at the past, what we see is that there are much more successful ways to sort of integrate those tendencies. And so when your only example of sort of literal monarchy, which is a government ruled by one person, is Hitler or Mussolini, you're going to think in a different way than if you're like, hey, what about Elizabeth I? What about Louis XIV? Is there a pagan quality in Louis XIV's France? Yeah, you can see that, and that's certainly the way the Puritans of his day, responded to, Louis the 14th, being the most Catholic king, or whatever. But that potential still exists within us. And so when you look at, here is the domain of solutions to the problems that we have today. And I'm not saying that you can literally restore Elizabeth I or Louis XIV, or Augustus Caesar or anything like that. But those are part of our heritage. Those are sources of meaning that we can draw on as we try to reinvent how we have to live in the 21st century. And I think that there's just no one who can come out and say, oh, how we have to live and govern ourselves in the 21st century, has to be a clone of something from the 20th century. I think the 20th century was we learned a lot in that century, and most of the experiments really failed. And I would say that largely not only of the 20th, but also of the 19th in many ways. Mm-hmm. And so the ability to kind of step beyond that and simultaneously think from first principles and also accept all of history, as ours. I sometimes describe myself as a, quote, reactionary. I like that because it's a term of abuse. It's like saying queer, and I'm like, yeah, I'm a reactionary. And what that means to me overwhelmingly is, there's this great line of this 19th century German historian, Leopold von Ranke, who said, all eras stand equal before God. And if you accept that all eras stand equal before God, you have to take Elizabethan England just as seriously as you take the New Deal or libertarianism or Nazi Germany. And once you do that, the range of perspectives that you have to consider becomes enormously larger. And that's really the point of Gray Mirror. So I may come to certain places, and you may come to others with that. But that's the experiment that we all have to be engaged in.
And what you're doing there and trying to unmask and bring to light the values and lessons we can learn from monarchists is precisely a Christian project of history, because you're not scandalizing your ancestors. You're doing. Remember what Jesus's opponents, he said, if you guys say if you were in the time of your ancestors, you wouldn't have killed the prophets. And that's kind of what you're doing there. You're saying, no, look at the good things of our ancestors, and we can chew the fish and spit out the bones. So it's a very thoroughly Christian thing to do in a certain context there. I can see it. So I think it's a very interesting thing you've embarked on, and I'd be curious to see how it evolves, and maybe we can pick up this conversation another time. It's very good.
Indeed. We'll see where the book goes, because I'm essentially writing the book online and letting people subscribe to it.
And you can do that at the website, right? Graymirror.substack.com. Very good. That's right. Thanks again, Curtis Yarvin.
All right. Thanks for a great conversation, David.
Very good.
And I'll see you around. All right, take care.